The most recognized brand on the planet was invented by a man who was desperately trying to cure his own drug addiction. He failed. John Stith Pemberton created Coca-Cola in 1886. He died 2 years later, broke, sick, and still addicted to morphine. He sold the rights to his formula in pieces to multiple investors in a series of chaotic transactions. His final remaining stake in the formula, sold directly to the man who would make millions from it, went for $300. And the drink that made that man rich? It contained cocaine. Not as a scandal, not as a secret, openly, advertised on the label, sold at pharmacies as a medicine. This is not the story of a refreshing beverage. This is the story of the American Civil War, a morphine epidemic that nobody talks about, a local prohibition law in Atlanta, Georgia, and one of the most tragic inventor stories in the history of American business. Let's start at the beginning, and the beginning is a battlefield. Okay, real question. How many times have you had a Coca-Cola in your life? Think about it. Birthday parties, fast food, long road trips, the specific satisfaction of a cold Coke with ice on a hot day, that particular flavor that is somehow immediately recognizable anywhere in the world, regardless of language or culture or context. Coca-Cola is everywhere. It is one of the most ubiquitous objects in human civilization. In 2023, the Coca-Cola Company reported over 2 billion servings consumed daily across more than 200 countries. 2 billion every single day. And almost nobody knows the actual story of how it came to exist. Because when people say, oh yeah, Coca-Cola used to have cocaine in it, and people do say this, it comes up at parties, it's one of those trivia facts that gets thrown around. They're usually treating it as a fun, quirky footnote, a strange little historical accident. It was not an accident. It was the entire point. And understanding why requires going back to 1865, to a battle that most people have never heard of, and to a saber wound that changed the history of the most valuable beverage company on earth. John Stith Pemberton was born on July 8, 1831, in Knoxville, Georgia. By the age of 19, he had earned his medical degree and a license to practice pharmacy, and had developed a genuine talent for chemistry. He married, had a son, opened a drugstore in Columbus, Georgia, and by all accounts was building a quiet and successful life. Then the Civil War happened. Pemberton enlisted in the Confederate Army and served in the 3rd Cavalry Battalion of the Georgia State Guard, achieving the rank of lieutenant colonel. He fought through most of the war, and on April 16, 1865, at the Battle of Columbus, which multiple sources describe as the last significant battle east of the Mississippi River, fought days after Lee had already surrendered at Appomattox, Pemberton was struck by a saber and slashed across the chest. He survived, but the wound was severe. And here is where the story takes a turn that will eventually lead to a billion-dollar industry. In 1865, the primary painkiller available to wounded soldiers was morphine. This was not a fringe treatment or a controversial choice. It was standard medical practice. Morphine was effective at managing pain in a way that nothing else available at the time could match. The problem was that nobody fully understood addiction yet. Germ theory itself had only recently been established. The concept of chemical dependency as a medical condition was not well developed. Doctors prescribed morphine because it helped patients, and they did not have the frameworks to fully understand what happened when patients couldn't stop needing it. The result was what some historians have called a morphine epidemic in post-Civil War America. Hundreds of thousands of veterans returned home dependent on the drug that had been given to them by military physicians. It was sometimes called the soldier's disease. Pemberton was one of them. By the time the war ended and he returned to civilian life in Atlanta, Pemberton was a trained pharmacist and chemist who understood drugs better than most people, and he was addicted to one of them. He knew it. He recognized the problem. In 1866, he began experimenting with opium-free painkillers. His first attempt was something called Dr. Tuggle's compound syrup of globe flower, made from a toxic plant called buttonbush. That didn't work, so he kept experimenting. He was going to invent a cure, Eventually, Pemberton turned his attention to a product out of Europe that was becoming increasingly fashionable among the wealthy and the medically minded. It was called Vin Mariani, a tonic wine created by Corsican chemist Angelo Mariani in 1863. The concept was straightforward. Take Bordeaux wine, add coca leaf extract. The ethanol in the wine would extract the cocaine alkaloids from the leaves and deliver them to the drinker in a pleasant, socially acceptable form. Mariani's European formula contained 6 milligrams of cocaine per fluid ounce of wine. The version exported to America contained 7.2 milligrams per ounce, specifically formulated stronger because American competitors were already offering more potent coca products. Vin Mariani was enormously popular. Pope Leo XIII awarded Mariani an official Vatican gold medal and is documented to have been a regular consumer. Thomas Edison publicly endorsed it, claiming it helped him work longer hours. Ulysses S. Grant reportedly drank it while writing his memoirs. Mariani collected over 4,000 celebrity endorsements during his aggressive marketing campaigns, though how many of those were genuinely unsolicited versus commercially arranged is impossible to verify today. Pemberton created his own version, which he called Pemberton's French Wine Coca. His version added cola nut extract for caffeine and damiana, a South American herb used as a stimulant. He marketed it as a nerve tonic and cure-all, advertising it as particularly beneficial for morphine addiction, depression, alcoholism, and neurasthenia, a catch-all diagnosis for nervous exhaustion fashionable among middle-class white Southerners. Was it effective for the morphine addiction? No, not really. Pemberton continued to struggle with his addiction throughout this period and until his death, but his product was selling. He had investors and commercial momentum. And then Atlanta passed a prohibition law. In 1886, both Atlanta and Fulton County, Georgia, passed local prohibition ordinances. These were local laws. National prohibition wouldn't arrive until 1920, but they were significant enough to threaten Pemberton's business directly. French Wine Coca contained alcohol, and selling it in Atlanta was going to become illegal. Pemberton reformulated, working in a large brass kettle in his backyard. Genuinely how this happened, in his backyard, not a laboratory. Pemberton removed the wine from his formula and replaced it with sugar syrup. He kept the coca leaf extract. He kept the cola nut. He brought the mixture to Jacob's Pharmacy in Atlanta to be tested as a soda fountain drink. Here is where an accident changed history. When Pemberton's assistant was preparing a new glass of the beverage, he mixed the base syrup with carbonated water by mistake instead of plain water. The result was unexpectedly good. Pemberton tasted it, decided the carbonated version was superior, and pivoted to selling it as a fountain drink rather than a straight medicine. The result was Coca-Cola, first sold on May 8, 1886, at Jacob's Pharmacy as a medicine. Early Coca-Cola ads positioned the drink as a cure for headaches, fatigue, morphine addiction, dyspepsia, and neurasthenia. It was sold at soda fountains as a brain tonic and temperance alternative to alcohol, and it still contained cocaine. That was part of the point. You could not advertise Coca-Cola as a cure for fatigue and then remove the primary stimulant. First-year performance, 9 servings per day on average. $46 spent on advertising. Profit of around $50. By any financial measure, the launch of Coca-Cola was not a success. Here's where we need to be careful, because this is a topic where a lot of sources overclaim. The popular version suggests that early Coca-Cola was essentially a cocaine delivery system, that people were getting measurably high from drinking it. The reality is more nuanced. Early Coca-Cola contained an estimated 9 milligrams of cocaine per glass in its earliest formulation. A typical recreational dose of cocaine today is 50 to 75 milligrams, roughly 5 to 8 times more than what was in an early Coke. The cocaine content was real, but the psychoactive effects at that concentration were likely modest at best. More importantly, by 1902, the cocaine content had already been reduced to as little as 1/400th of a grain per ounce of syrup. Meaningful psychoactive effects at that concentration would have been essentially zero. Coca-Cola stopped using fresh coca leaves in 1903, switching to spent leaves with only trace amounts, completely cocaine-free by 1929. So the story is real, but the popular version tends to be exaggerated. What is not exaggerated is why the cocaine was removed, and this is the part of the story that almost nobody talks about. The popular narrative says cocaine was removed from Coca-Cola because of growing public health awareness about the dangers of the drug, and health concerns were genuinely part of the picture. Regulation was tightening, and public attitudes toward cocaine were shifting across the board. But that is not the complete story. Around the turn of the century, black laborers in the American South began using cocaine to help get through long, hard days of physical work. And when that happened, the conversation about cocaine in America changed rapidly and dramatically. While the medical profession had seen nothing wrong with offering a coca-laced tonic to white middle-class consumers for their fatigue and neurasthenia, it became an entirely different matter when black Americans used the same drug. Medical journals of the era published warnings about what they called the Negro cocaine menace. Newspapers ran stories, largely fabricated, claiming cocaine caused black men to commit crimes. The framing was racist, the data was distorted, and the political effect was immediate. According to historian Michael M. Cohen, writing in the peer-reviewed journal Southern Cultures, the removal of cocaine from Coca-Cola around 1903 was driven by a combination of factors: tightening regulations, shifting public attitudes, and critically, the racial politics of the Jim Crow South. The key point Cohen makes is this: the same product had been openly sold to white middle-class consumers for over a decade without controversy. It was the association of cocaine with black Americans that changed the timeline and the urgency. That same year, Candler called for a change to the formula, replacing cocaine with heavier doses of sugar and caffeine, and then started publicly denying that Coca-Cola had ever contained cocaine to begin with. The decision to remove cocaine from Coca-Cola was not driven by health concerns alone. Racial politics accelerated it and shaped its public framing significantly, and the subsequent denial by Candler that the product had ever contained cocaine erased even the original purpose of what Pemberton had created. By 1903, fresh coca leaves were gone from the formula. By 1929, completely cocaine-free. And here is the final piece. Coca-Cola still imports coca leaves today. The cocaine alkaloid is removed first by the Stepan Company in Maywood, New Jersey, the only facility in the United States legally authorized to process coca leaves. They extract the cocaine for pharmaceutical use. The remaining decoconized leaf material goes to Coca-Cola for flavor. Coca-Cola still uses coca leaves. They just take the cocaine out first. Now let's go back to Pemberton, because the ending of his story is the part that reframes everything. Pemberton invented Coca-Cola in 1886. He spent 2 years trying to build the business while simultaneously fighting his morphine addiction and deteriorating from stomach cancer. He sold pieces of his formula to multiple investors in a chaotic and disorganized way, his declining health and ongoing addiction affecting his judgment and his negotiating position. By 1888, just 2 years after he invented Coca-Cola, Pemberton had sold off all his remaining interest in the formula across multiple transactions. His final remaining stake was sold directly to Asa Candler for $300. Candler, in turn, spent a total of around $2,300 to consolidate full ownership from Pemberton and all the other investors Pemberton had already sold pieces to. $2,300 total for what would become one of the most valuable brands in the history of human commerce. Candler sold the company in 1919 for $25 million. Pemberton died from stomach cancer on August 16, 1888, at age 57. Poor, still addicted to morphine, his body was returned to Columbus, Georgia, and buried at Linwood Cemetery. His grave marker is engraved with symbols of his Confederate Army service and his Freemason membership. His son Charlie died just 6 years later, an opium user himself. The drink Pemberton invented to cure his addiction did not cure his addiction. The company he built to secure his family's financial future left his wife spending the rest of her life as a pauper, and the man who consolidated his work for $2,300 and turned it into $25 million then denied the product had ever contained cocaine, erasing even the original desperate purpose behind what Pemberton had spent his final years creating. So what do we actually take from all of this? Coca-Cola is the most consumed beverage on Earth, 2 billion servings a day, a logo instantly recognizable in every country on the planet, a brand so embedded in global culture that it has become almost a symbol of modernity itself. And it exists because a wounded veteran was desperately trying to cure his morphine addiction using a backyard chemistry experiment and an accidental splash of carbonated water. It got its name because it literally contained cocaine and caffeine. The removal of that cocaine was driven by a combination of health concerns, tightening regulation, and the racial politics of the Jim Crow South, and the man who invented it sold his final stake for $300. Candler took that $300 stake and turned it into $25 million. The next time someone hands you a Coke, that cold, familiar, impossibly ubiquitous drink, you are holding the accidental byproduct of one of the saddest stories in American business history. A man's desperate attempt to solve his own pain turned into a product that made someone else extraordinarily rich. That's not the story on the label, but it is the actual story. And hey, at least they took the cocaine out. Eventually. If this made you look at your next Coke a little differently, good. There are more origin stories where this came from. Food and drink you consume every day with histories stranger, darker, and more complicated than the branding would ever tell you. Subscribe if you want to keep pulling at those threads. That's just a theory, a food theory. Bon appétit!